The following episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.
Good morning, USA, and welcome to another episode of the Bernie or Bust Show. Today we're going to be talking to two followers of the Bernie or Bust Show. The first one sometimes is worried that I'm a little too harsh on conservatives, particularly rural conservatives who may have traditional values. And by traditional, we may consider homophobia traditional, but I don't know why we would call it a value, but I guess that's a value, a bad value, and other problems on the right that people on the left can't overlook. That's one set of comments. The other set of comments is from Keaton Weiss, and he's not really commenting on my show. It's more like I'm commenting on his show and then he's commenting back. And so I've talked about that already in another episode. As the conversation continues, we'll talk more about the kinds of voters who might be traditional liberals. The kind that Phil Oakes decries in the song, "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." Keaton, to me, seems to be pandering to them a little bit and trying to soft pedal the Bernie or Bust ideology, trying to make excuses almost for the Bernie or Bust people and why they are so militant. So in this show, I'd like to address both people and the way they feel about these two groups of people who are not necessarily happily in Bernie's camp, but who may end up there anyway because of their shared concerns. But I don't want to overlook how many of their concerns are not shared, and so we'll talk about all that. The first follower of the Bernie or Bust show is having conversations with me in good faith. He doesn't look down on gay marriage. He doesn't look down on transgender people. He doesn't look down on polyamorists. So we're assuming conversations are happening with each other in good faith. At the same time, he's trying to make the point that insulting people on the right may not be the best way to bring them into the fold. If they don't like gay marriage, and if they put down immigrants and welfare moms and women and so forth, there's no reason that they can't still want economic justice. And while it's true, I agree that they want economic justice for good reasons, I can't have good faith discussions with them about the other issues. The problem comes when we think of it as a package deal, and we do that with politics. We think, well, okay, we're going to have economic justice and a return to traditional American values, and you can't package those things. And perhaps they'll say, well, we can't have economic justice and gay marriage, so I guess we're just going to have to get over the idea that we can accept gay marriage and have economic justice. And so then deal making happens and slippery slopes happen, and we end up compromising with evil. And we've been doing this in both political parties for a long time. And then people throw the idea in front of you that you're requiring a purity test. You shouldn't need a purity test. We can't have everything we want. But what I talk about then is dog shit on a plate. We have a plate of delicious organic food and a little bit of dog shit. And I say, what should we do with this dog shit? Should we eat it first? Should we mix it in with all the other food and then try to eat it? Or should we scrape that dog shit off the plate? And that's what I say to people who use the expression purity test. I say, well, you eat your shit if you want to, but I'm not going to. And when we're talking about identity politics, there are kinds of issues that we can't push off to the side. We can only push them off of our plates. And so I don't care if you say that I need a purity test. Under those circumstances, I will stick to my guns, figuratively, and I will say, nope, we're not going to have that. We're not going to go there. We're not going to put down black and brown people and say that they deserve. We're not going to refuse to accept Colin Kaepernick's taking a knee when the national anthem is played. We're not going to pretend that he means something by that he doesn't mean. We're not going to read into that things that aren't true. And so that's just one issue. We have to talk about these issues. We have to have good faith discussions about these issues, and we can't let people bully us into saying, well, we want some of the same things, so then we're just going to have to compromise on the other things. It's just not going to work that way. We don't need that kind of a country. We've had that kind of lesser evilism for 60 or 70 years, longer than that, and we can't keep going like that. So that wraps up the conversation I wanted to have with the first Bernie or Bust television follower. The second one is with Keaton, and we're going to talk about this on Wednesday night. You'll probably see the ensuing conversation on this channel. When Keaton and I were talking about this on Facebook, he offered this reply to my frustration that we shouldn't be soft pedaling Bernie or Bust or Bernie or Trump to comfortable Democrats. So he said, once we get to the point where it seems Bernie will have the delegate lead going into the convention, I will absolutely be on the Bernie or Bust page, because at that point it can only be taken from us at the convention via a superdelegate coup. Right now, my concern is getting us to the point where we have that lead secured, and I'm not sure that Bernie or Bust is the best persuasion strategy at this moment. The problem I have with this is that we're not operating in good faith with people who could vote for Biden, Buttigieg, Warren, Klobuchar, or Bloomberg. My point is that you can only vote for those candidates in bad faith. So this Wednesday evening, the point I will attempt to make is that Bernie or Bust belligerents may not be well received by polite people, but that confrontation may be necessary to persuade comfortable Democrats that there is simply no escape from the reality of the Bernie or Trump swing voters. In my view, there is no ethically conscionable reason not to warn them whether or not they like it. The central point is that all conversations about Bernie's candidacy must be held in good faith. Good faith precludes operating from an agenda that accepts the oppression of some groups of people. And traditional liberals have been just as guilty of that as traditional conservatives. The only reason I can think of to soft pedal Bernie or Bust Bernie or Trump is because good faith sorts of liberals merely have yet to wrap their minds around why voting for Biden, Warren, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, or Bloomberg is unconscionable in good faith. But I do not assume good faith. I assume self-interest. For that reason, I see no reason to refrain from calling out selfish people and explaining to them, with whatever force is necessary, that they must stop bullying and oppressing other groups of people. And that applies to the first follower I was talking about. I think violence is necessary sometimes. We have Frederick Douglass telling us that power concedes nothing without demand. And then we have bullies telling us, oh, we can't resort to violence. We can't keep our guns, for example. And what I say is, well, sometimes there is a good use for guillotines and pitchforks. And without those guillotines and pitchforks, we're going to continue not to make the demand that Frederick Douglass is talking about. Turning the other cheek won't always work in my book. And I've seen this borne out as a student of history. I've seen how it works in history. And Frederick Douglass is right. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And so we need to make that demand. Bernie or Bust is a way to make that demand without guillotines or pitchforks. But if that doesn't work, and you continue to see the violence and unrest around the world right now, then you'll say, well, maybe we should have been a little more persistent with the Bernie or Bust, Bernie or Trump information, and then maybe we wouldn't need the pitchforks and the guillotines. The point that Keaton made in his podcast is that traditional liberals like to think well of themselves. We need to stop allowing them to think well of themselves when their closeted bigotry is every bit as oppressive as the less closeted bigotry they decry on the right. We need them to understand that it's not me, meaning my own individual self or my own little tribe of people. It's us. We're all in this together. Bernie's campaign works along three fault lines: rich versus poor, urban versus rural, old versus young. We need people on both sides of each divide to operate in good faith on behalf of each other to bridge the gap. When it is fair to assume bad faith, then it is fair to pull the gloves off. In whose best interests is it to engage in polite conversation with bullies? It's in the best interest of the bullies, and they know this. So then they can continue to gaslight us into believing that it's a simple misunderstanding about neoliberal economic and social injustice. I will not engage bullies on their terms, no matter how charming they are. My goal with bullies is to nullify and to neutralize them. Don't call me a bully when I bully bullies. It's like calling reverse racism. Accepting neoliberal arguments at face value will make it easier for other gaslighting sociopaths who are not closeted to exploit the good faith actors who want life to improve for everyone. Here's a bit more on the fault lines I was talking about earlier, especially between young and old.
Because even though seniors have begun to move towards him, the basic dynamics of this primary remain what they've been from the very beginning. Biden versus Bernie is an epic generational clash. It is boomers and older versus Gen X and younger. While both candidates have working class support, Biden has a particular strength with African Americans and Bernie has a particular strength with Latinos, the biggest dividing line has always been age. A new poll of college students certainly underscores that point. According to Chegg College Pulse, while 43% of college students back Bernie Sanders, a mere 8% support Biden. That puts him in fourth place behind not only Sanders, but also Elizabeth Warren and Andrew Yang. Meanwhile, despite that movement of our elders, they do continue to strongly favor Biden. Just take a look at this Pew Research poll of voters. You can see that for Sanders, support decreases with every step up the age cohort, and for Biden, it is the exact opposite. The youngest cohort is split between Sanders and Biden by a margin of 40-10. The oldest cohort is perfectly inverse. Sanders garners only 10% to Biden's 40%. So if Bernie can win over just a few more points among seniors, he will be the nominee. Now, what is causing this great generational divide? Well, honestly, it's not hard to figure out. Take a look at this chart of generational wealth. The older you are in this country in general, the better you've done. For boomers, by the time they hit age 35, they collectively own 21% of national wealth. For Gen X, by age 35, they own just 9%. For millennials, though, the situation is even more dire. Currently, they own just 3% of national wealth. The entire generation has been screwed, sent to fight and die in the nation's endless wars, promised that college was the end-all be-all, only to be saddled with insurmountable debt and graduating into the post-financial crash ruins. For those who didn't go to college, finding that the only jobs for those lacking a college degree were often not only low-paying, but degrading, with distant bosses who don't see you as humans but numbers on a spreadsheet, or cogs in a machine to be disposed of at will. When younger voters push for greater economic mobility, they're not asking for handouts. They're only asking for the same chance at stability of their parents and their grandparents. Now, I want to be clear. Inequality and the outright abandonment by political elites of the American working class has no generational boundaries. But our elders came of age during a time when worker productivity was actually tied to wage growth, before unions had been gutted and trade deals passed and Walmart and Amazon given unprecedented monopolistic powers to suck the life out of our communities. They came of age during a time when social mobility was at least more of a reality, not a complete myth, when a small-town public education actually was sufficient, and the gig economy and all its hellish anti-worker dystopia had not yet even entered our lexicon. So it makes sense that they would find the let's just pretend none of this happened approach of Joe Biden appealing. Not exciting exactly, but comfortable, safe. And while our elders, too, prefer Bernie's approach on the issues, the relentless pundit drumbeat about how he's a risky choice combined with a lingering Cold War mentality leads them most often to resist feeling the burn. So as we head into Iowa, this is the battle between the old ways and the new.
I'll link to this tweet that shows how Gen Xers have lagged far behind baby boomers in the percentage of U.S. household wealth, and my oldest child is a millennial. He's 36 years old, and when she was talking about the percentage, I think she said 3% or something versus the Gen Xers and the baby boomers. Go back and watch it again. Watch her whole clip on this. It's really interesting how badly the younger generations are getting ripped off by our economy and by our political system. Now I'd like to quickly summarize this article by Anthony DiMaggio, The Myth of the Electable Democrat. He's picking on a recent op-ed from Ezra Klein, and he goes on to describe Ezra Klein and the kind of pundit he is and the kind of place he's coming from. Suffice it to say, he is a neoliberal sock puppet. The claim that only neoliberal Democrats are viable candidates has been exposed in the era of Donald Trump. Trump's election demonstrates that candidates don't need to appeal to the center to win. Reactionary media and political leaders have been pulling Republican voters to the right for decades. Given this shift, the vast majority of Republican voters are willing to vote for most any right-wing candidate running in the general election so long as they aren't a Democrat. Claims were commonly made in 2016 that Trump would spell doom for the Republican Party since his brazenly xenophobic, racist, sexist, and authoritarian rhetoric would never appeal to moderate Republican voters. Clearly, this wasn't the case. An overwhelming 88% of Republican voters turned out in favor of Trump. Klein recognizes that Republicans no longer need to rely on moderation to win because of the rightward movement of the party, but he and other Democrats have no insight into what is politically possible were the Democratic Party to commit to building a durable popular base in pursuit of progressive change. And establishment Democrats have no vision for how to make their party relevant at a time when nearly half of Americans don't bother to vote, and when the vast majority of Americans express little to no trust in government. As a neoliberal entity, the party is fundamentally incapable of operating as a democratic medium for raising support among disadvantaged groups. Bernie Sanders' rise in the 2016 Democratic primary provides more evidence to challenge traditional neoliberal notions of electability. As I've documented, the mainstreaming of Sanders' progressive agenda was revealed in polling at the time, which found that 1/4 of Democrats in 2016 believed Sanders' identification as a democratic socialist made him more electable, while less than 1 in 10 felt it made him less so, and with 2/3 who thought it made no difference. In other words, 90% of Democrats felt the socialism stigma was irrelevant to their political calculations. Such sentiment undermines the notion that only neoliberal Democrats can appeal to voters. Looking at the 2016 election, we see the poverty behind the claim that Americans thirst for a neoliberal Democrat. Hillary Clinton, the quintessential corporate-friendly politician, failed to defeat one of the most unpopular presidential candidates in modern history. And her party stumbled badly when it came to cultivating support from economically vulnerable Americans. As documented at the time, Donald Trump did not gain disaffected voters who were harmed by manufacturing outsourcing so much as pro-free trade Democrats lost them. The Democratic Party lost 3.5 times as many votes from those living in the Rust Belt areas hardest hit by corporate free trade than Republicans gained when comparing Republican and Democratic presidential vote tallies from 2012 and 2016. The story of the modern Democratic Party is one of demobilizing working-class Americans. This is hardly a radical claim or one lacking historical foundation. The party shamelessly embraced center-right pro-business policies for the last 25 years and as a result has failed to build a stable coalition that can consistently win and hold political power. Looking at the 2020 Democratic primaries, we again see the limits of Democratic centrism. Polling data in the run-up to the primaries demonstrates that those depicted as the most electable Democratic candidates benefit from little to no support from disadvantaged socioeconomic groups. Pete Buttigieg, a neoliberal Democrat if there ever was one, receives virtually no support from people of color and from the less educated. Joe Biden's campaign has done little to nothing to inspire support from younger and poorer Americans. An overwhelming 73% of his supporters are 50 and older, while just 7% are 18 to 29, and only 19% are 30 to 49, for a total of just 26% who are under 50. Elizabeth Warren polls well among whites, liberals, and those with a college education, but not so well with everyone else. She benefits from little enthusiasm from people of color who make up just 4% of her supporters. By comparison, Bernie Sanders does better among disadvantaged groups. Looking at generational cohorts, Sanders' largest group of supporters are 18 to 29-year-olds, followed by 30 to 49-year-olds. He receives 6 times more support from the 18 to 29 age group than he does from those 65 and over. He is more likely to be supported by liberals, and he receives a range of support from different educational groups, including high school graduates and those with 2- and 4-year college degrees. Sanders also polls well among Black, white, and Latino voters, in contrast to Buttigieg and Warren. Finally, Sanders' support is significantly higher among middle and lower income Americans. He is more than 2 times as likely to receive support from Americans with moderate to low incomes, households earning less than $75,000 a year, compared to those with higher incomes over $75,000. By comparison, Warren receives twice as much support from higher income Americans than from those with lower incomes. Buttigieg polls equally among higher and lower income groups, while Biden performs better with higher income over lower income Americans by a ratio of 1.3 to 1. Sanders' main challenge moving forward is that he isn't really a Democrat, but a progressive independent running in the Democratic primaries, and this clearly hurt him in the 2016 election. As I've documented, Sanders was more likely to receive support from Americans who self-identified as political independents, not as Democrats. Most Democratic primary voters in 2016 preferred an establishment candidate of the Clinton variety. This challenge remains moving into the 2020 primaries. Biden is clearly the central establishment figure in the party, and he retains significant support from the party's sizable, centrist, corporate-friendly base, which will be well represented in primary races across the country. 9 months out, it's impossible to know how the 2020 general election will turn out, but based on available evidence, it's clear that the more of the same approach to propping up Democratic neoliberal politics will continue to fail in cultivating sustained mass support. As an electoral strategy, it's failed to produce consistent Democratic victories despite the promises of its adherents over the last few decades. The 2016 election was the most extreme case of the party's failure, as witnessed by the mass demobilization of formerly Democratic voters who felt betrayed by the party's pro-business politics. Biden, should he win the Democratic nomination, will do little to inspire traditionally disadvantaged demographic groups to vote. Based on pre-election polling data, it's clear that Warren, Buttigieg, and Biden are incapable of building a progressive electoral coalition that will unite white liberals, the poor, younger Americans, and people of color. As a professional politician, Sanders hasn't been central to progressive movement building, but he has declared support for these movements via his alliances with Fight for 15, the Madison protests, and Occupy Wall Street. Contrary to the other Democratic primary candidates, he recognizes the importance and centrality of such movements to driving progressive political change. Furthermore, the public is increasingly attuned to the bankruptcy of Democratic establishment politics, regardless of what the party's pundits say. Their efforts to prop up Bill Clinton's new Democrat coalition represent a last desperate gasp of air for a party that has struggled for years to remain relevant in an era of mass discontent with government. Sanders' rising popularity in recent primary polling suggests that much of the party's base hungers for a serious left alternative to the Democrats' pro-business politics. So, stacked on top of all of the other arguments about the divisions between age and so forth, we have to get off this idea that a centrist Democrat can even hope to defeat Donald Trump. And the only answer then is to find a way to vote for Bernie Sanders in the primaries before we get to the brokered convention and all hell breaks loose.
Get on board the Bernier bus train. Come get on board the Bernier bus train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Oh, get on board the Bernier bus train.
The preceding episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.